The pre-dawn silence of Sweet Retreat felt heavier than usual as Elena Rossi unlocked the bakery door, her keys jingling like wind chimes in the empty street. At 38, she moved through her morning routine with the precision of a clockmaker, flour measured to the gram, temperatures calibrated to the degree, timers set with military accuracy. Yet behind her practiced efficiency lay a growing hollow ache, a yearning for something she couldn't quite name. The bakery's warm yellow walls displayed framed photographs of her creations, perfect cannolis dusted with powdered sugar, tiramisu layered with mathematical precision, biscotti arranged in neat rows like golden soldiers. Customers praised her consistency, her reliability, her ability to deliver exactly what they expected, every single time. But Elena found herself wondering when expectation had become a prison. She pulled her dark hair back into its usual bun and began preparing the day's first batch of sfogliatelle, the shell-shaped pastries that had become her signature. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar motions, rolling, folding, shaping, while her mind drifted to memories of her grandmother's kitchen, where chaos and magic had danced together in ways that no recipe could capture. Nana Sophia had been gone for 5 years now, leaving behind only a sparse recipe journal that Elena had read and reread until the pages were soft as fabric. The journal contained basic instructions for everyday Italian sweets, but nothing that explained the legendary sunlight tart that had made Sophia famous throughout their small town. People still asked Elena about it, their eyes growing distant with remembrance, describing flavors that seemed to capture sunshine itself. But Sophia had taken that secret to her grave, or so Elena had always believed. The morning passed in its usual rhythm of steady customers and polite compliments. Mrs. Chin picked up her weekly order of amaretti, commenting as always on their perfect texture. Young Marco grabbed a cornetto before school, chocolate smearing his cheek as he ran out the door with his mother calling after him. The local bookstore owner, Mr. Patterson, ordered his usual espresso and almond biscotti, settling into his corner table with the morning paper. Elena smiled and nodded and counted change, but part of her felt like she was watching her life from behind glass. It was the mundane nature of these interactions that weighed on her most. She had become a supporting character in everyone else's story, the reliable baker who provided the backdrop for their daily rituals. When had she stopped being the protagonist of her own life? When had creativity given way to such suffocating routine? The afternoon brought its own familiar challenges. A last-minute wedding cake order that required her to work through lunch. A supplier who delivered the wrong type of vanilla extract, forcing her to make do with what she had. The espresso machine that chose today to develop a mysterious grinding sound that made her wince with each cup. These were the small battles that filled her days, each one chipping away at the joy she had once found in her craft. It was while reorganizing the storage room that afternoon, moving boxes to make room for tomorrow's delivery, that Elena discovered the wooden box. Tucked behind bags of flour and forgotten cans of tomatoes, it sat like a time capsule waiting to be opened. The box was small, no bigger than her palm, carved from what looked like olive wood and worn smooth by countless hands. The craftsmanship was exquisite, tiny vines and leaves etched into the surface, with an artist's precision. Elena's heart skipped as she lifted the box. It felt significant in her hands, weighted with more than just its physical mass. Inside, nestled in faded purple velvet that had once been rich and luxurious, were tiny cloth sachets filled with dried herbs and flower petals she couldn't identify. Some were familiar, rosemary, thyme, lavender, but others were completely foreign, their scents exotic and mysterious. She held one of the sachets to her nose and inhaled deeply. The aroma was complex, layered, almost musical in its progression of notes. There was something Mediterranean about it, something that spoke of sun-baked hillsides and ancient traditions. For a moment, she could have sworn she heard Nana's laugh echoing through the storage room, that distinctive sound that had always made Elena feel like everything would be all right. But when she turned around, she was alone among the flour bags and forgotten inventory. That evening, as she cleaned the display cases and prepared to close, Elena noticed something odd. Nana's favorite teacup, A delicate ceramic piece with hand-painted violets that had been Sophia's pride and joy was sitting on the counter beside the register. She was certain she had put it away in the office that morning, safely tucked in the desk drawer where she kept her most precious mementos. Elena picked up the cup, frowning at its unexpected presence. Even empty, it carried a faint floral scent that seemed to linger in the air like a whispered secret. She carried the cup back to the office, placing it firmly in the drawer and closing it with a decisive click. But as she walked away, she could have sworn she heard the drawer creak open behind her, though when she turned to look, everything was as she had left it. The next morning brought news that made Elena's heart sink. Fusion Flavors, a trendy new bakery with neon signs and Instagram-worthy pastries, had opened just 3 blocks away. Their window display boasted macarons in impossible colors: electric blue, neon pink, metallic gold, croissants filled with matcha cream, and edible glitter, cakes that looked more like modern art than food. The prices were twice what Elena charged, but that didn't seem to matter to the customers. Elena watched from her own doorway as people lined up around the block, their phones already out and ready to capture the perfect shot. She recognized several of her regular customers in the crowd, their faces bright with excitement as they waited to try something new, something different, something that would look good on their social media feeds. Maybe it's time to try something new, she murmured to herself, but the words felt foreign in her mouth. Change had never been her strength. Consistency was her brand, her identity, her safety net. But as she watched the crowd at Fusion Flavors grow throughout the day, she couldn't shake the feeling that safety was becoming its own kind of trap. The impact was immediate and devastating. Her usual morning rush dwindled to a trickle. The afternoon coffee crowd, once her most reliable source of income, seemed to have evaporated overnight. Even Mrs. Chun, loyal customer of 7 years, called to apologize as she canceled her weekly amaretti order. "I'm so sorry, Elena," she said, her voice genuinely regretful. "My daughter saw these rainbow macarons on Instagram, and she's been begging me to try them. Maybe next week." But Elena knew there might not be a next week, at least not the way things had been. The writing was on the wall, spelled out in neon lights and social media posts. The world was changing, and she was being left behind. That night, alone in her apartment above the bakery, Elena found herself opening the wooden box again, letting the mysterious herbs fill her senses with their strange, compelling fragrances. She spread the sachets out on her kitchen table, studying them in the lamplight. Some contained what looked like dried flower petals, roses, perhaps, or jasmine. Others held seeds she couldn't identify, small and dark and somehow ancient-looking. On impulse, she took a small pinch of the unfamiliar herbs and ground them between her fingers. The scent that rose was unlike anything she had ever encountered, complex, warm, with notes of honey and sunshine, and something that reminded her of childhood summers spent in her grandmother's garden. The aroma seemed to awaken something deep in her memory, a connection to traditions and knowledge that had been buried under years of routine and expectation. Without really thinking about it, she found herself heading downstairs to the kitchen, turning on the lights, and beginning to experiment. The familiar space felt different in the darkness, more mysterious, more alive with possibility. She started with a basic tart shell, but as she worked, her hands seemed to move of their own accord, guided by instincts she had forgotten she possessed. A pinch of the mystery herbs went into the dough, releasing an aroma that made her kitchen smell like a Mediterranean garden. A few flower petals found their way into the filling, their colors bleeding into the cream like watercolors on wet paper. Instead of her usual refined white sugar, she reached for a bag of older, less processed sugar she had found in the back of Nana's cupboard, sugar that was amber-colored and rich with molasses undertones. The difference was immediately apparent. The dough felt different under her hands, more alive somehow. The filling took on a golden hue that seemed to glow from within. And the aroma was intoxicating, filling the kitchen with scents that spoke of traditions stretching back generations. But it was when she reached for Nana's old herb grinder that things became truly extraordinary. The grinder had been sitting in the back of a drawer for years, neglected and forgotten. It was ornate, made of brass and wood, covered in tiny markings that looked almost like musical notes. Elena had always assumed they were purely decorative, but now, as she examined them more closely, she wondered if they might mean something more. She placed a careful selection of the mysterious herbs into the grinder and began to turn the handle. The mechanism was old but still smooth, and as the herbs were crushed and ground, the grinder produced a soft, singing sound that seemed to resonate in her bones. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, like a melody from a half-remembered dream. Elena paused, listening to the music emerging from the ancient tool. The sound seemed to change as she adjusted the pressure, as if the grinder were responding to the different herbs and their proportions. She found herself experimenting, adding a pinch of this, a touch of that, listening to the way the music changed until she found a combination that produced a pure, clear tone that made her heart skip. The grinding complete, she added the herb mixture to her tart, working by feel and instinct rather than following any written recipe. The kitchen filled with an aroma that was both familiar and completely foreign, as if she were channeling the accumulated wisdom of countless generations of women who had stood in kitchens like this one, creating magic with nothing more than simple ingredients and loving hands. As the tart baked, Elena sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by the scattered herb sachets, and tried to make sense of what was happening. The teacup, which she had locked firmly in her office drawer, was somehow sitting on the table beside her, its painted violets seeming to glow in the lamplight. She no longer questioned how it had gotten there. She simply accepted its presence as part of the mystery that seemed to be unfolding around her. The days that followed were a blur of preparation and growing anxiety. The local food festival was only a week away, and Elena found herself torn between her planned offerings and the strange, experimental tart she had created in that moment of midnight inspiration. She made batch after batch of her reliable classics, the cannolis that had won her first place 3 years running, the tiramisu that made tourists book return trips to their small town, the biscotti that had been featured in the regional food magazine. But her eyes kept drifting to the single, unplanned tart sitting on the cooling rack. It looked different from her usual creations. The surface was more golden, almost luminous, and the aroma it gave off was complex and mysterious. She had tasted it, of course, and the flavor was unlike anything she had ever created. It was sweet but not cloying, rich but not heavy, with layers of taste that seemed to unfold on the tongue like a story being told. The problem was that she couldn't recreate it. She had tried twice, following what she thought were the same steps, but the results were good but not extraordinary. It was as if that first tart had been touched by something beyond her understanding, something that couldn't be summoned at will. Her regular customers continued to drift away, drawn by the novelty and Instagram appeal of fusion flavors. Elena watched her daily receipts dwindle, calculating how much longer she could keep the bakery open if the trend continued. The thought of closing Sweet Retreat, of admitting defeat to a bakery that valued presentation over substance, made her stomach clench with anxiety. But there was something else happening too, something she couldn't quite articulate. The herbs in the wooden box seemed to be calling to her, their scents growing stronger each day. The teacup appeared in new locations with increasing frequency, on the windowsill, beside the cash register, even once on top of the flour bin. And at night, when the bakery was closed and the street was empty, Elena sometimes heard music drifting through the building, soft and melodic, like the sound the herb grinder made but carried on the wind. The morning of the festival dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn light that made everything look like it was painted in gold. Elena had barely slept, her mind racing between excitement and terror. She had decided, in a moment of desperation or inspiration, to bring the mysterious tart to the festival alongside her usual offerings. She couldn't explain why, but something deep inside her insisted that it belonged there. She loaded her van with careful precision. 3 dozen cannolis, each one perfect in its shell-shaped glory. 2 large tiramisu, their surfaces dusted with cocoa powder in precise patterns. Biscotti arranged in wicker baskets like golden jewels, and, wrapped carefully in parchment paper and tucked into a corner of her display case without a label, the tart that had emerged from her late-night experiment. The festival grounds were already bustling with activity when Elena arrived. Vendors arranged their stalls in neat rows along the town square, the air thick with the mingled scents of garlic and cinnamon, fresh bread, and roasted coffee. The competition was fierce this year. Artisanal cheese makers, fusion taco trucks, craft breweries, and molecular gastronomy specialists who turned simple ingredients into scientific marvels. Elena had claimed the same spot she used every year, a corner location with good foot traffic and a view of the town fountain. She arranged her display with practiced efficiency, each pastry positioned to catch the light, price tags perfectly aligned, everything designed to showcase the craftsmanship and quality that had built her reputation. But as she worked, Elena felt a familiar weight settling over her shoulders. Around her, other vendors were setting up displays that looked fresh and exciting. Towers of colorful macarons, liquid nitrogen ice cream that smoked and bubbled, artisanal donuts with names like Unicorn Dreams and Galaxy Glaze. Her own offerings, beautiful as they were, suddenly seemed tired and predictable, relics of a bygone era when people valued tradition over innovation. The first customers began arriving around noon, and Elena fell into the familiar rhythm of serving and smiling. The morning brought a steady stream of familiar faces, neighbors and friends who had been coming to the festival for years, tourists who appreciated traditional craftsmanship, food enthusiasts who valued authenticity over novelty. She sold a box of biscotti to a young couple on their honeymoon, watching as they fed each other small pieces and laughed at the crumbs that scattered across their shirts. A group of food bloggers with expensive cameras sampled her tiramisu, nodding approvingly as they took notes and snapped photos. A large family celebrating a reunion ordered 3 dozen cannolis, their children's faces lighting up at the sight of the golden shells filled with sweet ricotta cream. The compliments were warm and genuine, but Elena found herself going through the motions, her mind elsewhere. She kept glancing at the unlabeled tart tucked in the corner of her display case, wondering if she should offer it to anyone, wondering if anyone would even be interested in something so simple and unadorned. The afternoon brought larger crowds, but also stiffer competition. Elena watched as customers lined up at the molecular gastronomy stall, eager to try caviar made from balsamic vinegar and olive oil that had been transformed into edible pearls. The fusion taco truck had a line wrapped around the block, their Korean barbecue Italian fusion tacos creating a social media sensation. Even the traditional vendors seemed to be adapting to the new landscape. The German sausage stand had added kimchi and sriracha to their offerings. The French pastry chef was serving macarons in flavors inspired by popular cocktails. Everyone, it seemed, was evolving except Elena. It was nearly 3 o'clock when she noticed the elderly woman approaching her stall. Elena recognized her immediately, Signora Moretti, her grandmother's dearest friend, a woman who had known Sofia since they were girls together in the old country. Signora Moretti moved slowly, her cane tapping against the cobblestones in a rhythm that seemed almost musical, but her eyes were bright and sharp as they surveyed Elena's display. "Buongiorno, Elena," she said, her voice carrying the musical cadence of her native Italian. "Your grandmother would be so proud to see you here, carrying on the tradition." Elena smiled, but the words felt hollow. Tradition? Was that all she was now? A keeper of old recipes? A guardian of the past? "Thank you, Signora Moretti. How are you feeling today?" "Bene, bene," the old woman replied, but Elena noticed she was leaning heavily on her cane. "These old bones don't move as well as they used to, but the spirit is still strong. I come every year, looking for something that will remind me of the old days. Of your grandmother's kitchen." Elena felt a pang of guilt. She had never been able to recreate the magic of Nana Sofia's cooking, never been able to capture that ineffable quality that had made people talk about her grandmother's food with such reverence. The comparison had always felt like a weight on her shoulders, a standard she could never hope to meet. But then Signora Moretti's gaze fell on the unlabeled tart tucked in the corner of the display case. She tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. Her expression changed, growing more alert, more focused. Without asking permission, she reached out and picked up the tart, holding it close to her face and inhaling deeply. "Madonna mia," she whispered, and Elena saw something extraordinary happen. The old woman's eyes filled with tears, and her weathered face transformed, years seeming to fall away like autumn leaves. Her grip on the cane loosened, and for a moment she stood straighter, as if the very act of smelling the tart had restored something vital within her. "Elena, cara mia," Signora Moretti said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Where did you find this?" I made it," Elena stammered, suddenly self-conscious. "It was just an experiment. I found some old herbs in the storage room, and—" But Signora Moretti was already taking a bite, her eyes closing in what looked like rapture. She chewed slowly, deliberately, as if savoring not just the taste but the memory it awakened. Her free hand went to her chest, pressing against her heart, and Elena saw tears streaming down her cheeks. "This is impossible," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is La Torta del Sol, the sunlight tart, your grandmother's masterpiece." But how? She never wrote it down. She never told anyone the recipe. She always said. Signora Moretti paused, studying Elena's face with new intensity. She always said that the right person would discover it when the time was right. Elena felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The festival continued around them, but she felt suspended in a bubble of revelation, disconnected from the mundane world of commerce and competition. The sunlight tart? But that's just a story. A legend. I've tried for years to recreate it, but Nana's journal. The journal was never meant to contain this recipe, Signora Moretti interrupted gently. Sophia knew that some things cannot be written down. They must be felt, discovered, lived. She left you everything you needed, but she wanted you to find it yourself. To earn it. The old woman's words seemed to echo in Elena's mind as she tried to make sense of what she was hearing. The wooden box with its mysterious herbs. The teacup that kept appearing in unexpected places. The ancient grinder with its singing sound. Had these been clues all along? A puzzle left by her grandmother, waiting for her to solve? "Tell me," Signora Moretti said, setting the tart down carefully on the counter as if it were made of spun glass. "How did you make this? What did you do differently from your usual baking?" Elena's mind raced as she tried to remember every detail of that night. "I found an old wooden box in the storage room. It had herbs and flowers I didn't recognize. And I used Nana's old sugar instead of the refined kind I usually use. And the grinder." She paused, the memory suddenly vivid. "The grinder made a sound when I used it, like it was singing." Signora Moretti nodded slowly, as if Elena's words were confirming something she had long suspected. "The herbs are from the hills behind your grandmother's childhood home in Tuscany. She had them sent to her every year, dried and preserved in the old way by women who still remembered the ancient methods. The sugar is from sugar beets, not cane. It was what they used in the old country, before everything became so processed, so refined that it lost its soul." Elena listened, fascinated, as the old woman continued. "And the grinder?" Signora Moretti smiled, her eyes twinkling with something that might have been mischief. "The grinder belonged to Sophia's mother, and her mother before her. It was designed by a craftsman who understood that cooking is not just about taste and smell, but about sound and vibration. The markings on it are not decorative, they are musical notations, a guide to the specific tone that indicates when the herbs are ground to the perfect consistency." Elena felt as if she were walking through a dream. But why? Why hide it? Why make it so complicated? "Because," Signora Moretti said, her voice filled with infinite patience, "Sophia knew that the most precious things in life cannot be simply handed to us. They must be earned through understanding, through connection, through love. She watched you growing up, saw how you approached baking like a science rather than an art. She knew that for you to truly understand the sunlight tart, you would need to rediscover the joy of creation, the magic of intuition." The festival continued around them, but Elena felt suspended in a moment of profound understanding. She thought of all the times she had felt trapped by routine, stifled by expectation, reduced to a supporting character in her own story. All the times she had longed for something more, something that would reconnect her to the passion she had lost somewhere along the way. Your grandmother, Signora Moretti continued, believed that cooking was a form of love made visible. Every dish should tell a story, carry emotion, connect one heart to another. She saw you becoming too focused on perfection, on meeting others' expectations, and she feared you would lose the very thing that made you special, your ability to cook with your heart. Elena looked down at the tart, this impossible creation that had somehow emerged from her subconscious understanding. The golden surface seemed to glow in the afternoon light, and she could smell the complex layers of flavor, honey and herbs, flower petals and sunshine, all bound together by something indefinable but unmistakably real. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Signora Moretti smiled and patted Elena's hand with her weathered fingers. "Now, cara mia, you do what your grandmother always intended. You bake with your heart. You trust your instincts. You let the ingredients speak to you instead of forcing them to obey. You remember that the secret ingredient was never in any recipe, it was always in you." As word spread through the festival that Elena had somehow recreated the legendary sunlight tart, people began gathering around her stall. But these weren't just customers looking for a quick purchase. They were neighbors, friends, people who had known and loved her grandmother. Each bite of the tart seemed to unlock memories, stories, connections that had been dormant for years. Elena watched in amazement as her simple stall became a gathering place, a nexus of community and shared experience. She saw the young couple on their honeymoon feeding each other small pieces of a tart, their eyes closing in bliss as they tasted something that spoke to their souls. She watched the food bloggers put down their cameras and simply savor the moment, no longer interested in capturing the perfect shot but in experiencing something genuine and rare. But it was the children who affected her most deeply. A little girl with flour in her hair tugged on Elena's apron and asked, "Can you teach me to make sunshine?" And Elena, looking into those bright, eager eyes, realized that this was what her grandmother had always understood, that the greatest recipes were not formulas to be followed but inspiration to be shared. An elderly man who had been silent for most of the day suddenly spoke up, his voice cracking with emotion. "I haven't tasted anything like this since my own Nana made it for me in Sicily, 70 years ago. How did you know? How did you capture that exact flavor?" Elena found herself telling the story, the mysterious herbs, the singing grinder, the teacup that appeared and disappeared like a gentle ghost. With each detail, she saw understanding dawn in the faces around her. These were people who had grown up with stories of old-world magic, who remembered when cooking was about more than following recipes. As the festival wound down and the crowds began to disperse, Elena found herself alone with Signora Moretti. The old woman was carefully wrapping the remaining pieces of the sunlight tart in parchment paper, her movements reverent and precise. "I have a confession," Signora Moretti said, without looking up. "Your grandmother didn't just leave you the ingredients. She left you something else." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. "She wrote this for you, to be given when you were ready, when you had solved the puzzle and found your way back to yourself." Elena opened the notebook with trembling hands. The pages were filled with her grandmother's familiar handwriting, but these weren't recipes in the traditional sense. They were stories, memories of meals shared, emotions captured in flavors, techniques passed down through generations of women who understood that cooking was about far more than mere sustenance. "She knew," Elena whispered, tears blurring her vision as she read her grandmother's words. "She knew I would lose my way, and she knew I would find it again." "She knew," Signora Moretti confirmed, "because she had been where you are. We all have at some point. The question is whether we have the courage to remember who we really are, to trust in the gifts that have been given to us." That night, Elena sat in her apartment above the bakery, the notebook open on her lap, planning for tomorrow. But for the first time in years, she wasn't planning based on what she thought people expected. She was planning based on what excited her, what called to her creative spirit, what would honor the legacy of love and intuition that her grandmother had left her. The pages of the notebook were filled with wisdom that went far beyond cooking. Sophia had written about the importance of trusting one's instincts, about the way ingredients could speak to those who knew how to listen, about the magic that happened when technique was combined with genuine love and intention. The secret, her grandmother had written, is not in the perfection of the product, but in the purity of the intention. When you cook with love, people can taste it. When you bake with joy, it becomes contagious. When you trust your heart, miracles happen. Elena read until dawn, absorbing not just the techniques and variations her grandmother had recorded, but the philosophy behind them. This wasn't just about cooking, it was about living authentically, about having the courage to be vulnerable, about understanding that the greatest art came from the deepest connection to one's true self. The next morning, Sweet Retreat reopened with a new energy that was immediately apparent to anyone who entered. Elena had spent the night experimenting, guided by the stories in her grandmother's hidden notebook and the mysterious herbs that had waited so patiently for her to discover them. She created variations on the sunlight tart, some with lavender and lemon that captured the essence of a Mediterranean summer, others with wild mint and honey that spoke of childhood afternoons spent in secret gardens. But it wasn't just the new recipes that transformed the bakery. Elena herself was different. She moved through her kitchen with newfound purpose, listening to the ingredients, trusting her instincts, allowing each creation to tell its own story. The precision was still there. She would always be technically excellent, but now it was paired with something that had been missing for too long: joy. The customers came in waves, drawn by word of mouth and the intoxicating aromas that seemed to spill from the bakery like music. But Elena noticed something different in their faces. They weren't just buying pastries, they were seeking connection, hoping to taste something that would remind them of their own grandmothers, their own lost pieces of themselves. And Elena, for the first time in years, felt truly alive. She began teaching informal classes, sharing not just techniques but the philosophy that her grandmother had embedded in every recipe. She talked about the importance of intuition, about the way ingredients could guide you if you knew how to listen, about the magic that happened when you stopped trying to control every variable and started trusting the process. Months passed, and Sweet Retreat became more than just a bakery. It became a place where people came to remember, to connect, to taste the kind of authenticity that had become rare in their increasingly fast-paced world. Elena's reputation spread beyond the town, attracting visitors from distant cities who had heard about the baker who had rediscovered the lost art of cooking with soul. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the light fell just right through the bakery windows, Elena would catch a whiff of that familiar floral scent and know that her grandmother was still there, still guiding, still proud of the woman who had finally learned to bake with her heart wide open. The sunlight tart had become more than just a recipe recovered. It had become a symbol of something larger, of traditions that transcend time, of love that speaks through generations, of the courage to trust in mysteries that cannot be explained, only experienced. Elena kept the wooden box on her counter now, no longer hidden in the storage room but displayed prominently as a reminder of the journey she had taken. And when customers asked about it, she would smile and tell them the story, not just of a recipe, but of a woman who had learned to listen to the wisdom of her heart, guided by the unspoken love of a grandmother who had known that the most precious gifts are those we must discover for ourselves. The herbs sang their ancient songs as Elena ground them each morning, and the ceramic teacup with its painted violets sat proudly beside the register, no longer a mystery but a beacon, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary magic happens when we finally learn to trust in the extraordinary love that has been waiting for us all along.